Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, July 5th, 2025. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, President of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also president of Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times News organization. He has led many successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives to the Middle East for the Universal Peace Federation. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry, and welcome to our audience, both in the United States and throughout the world. Today's program is on South Korea's security concerns about U.S. policy. We know that we are in a critical moment in the alliance between the U.S. and South Korea. U.S. policy towards South Korea includes our military presence and our ready defense against North Korean aggression. The alliance is strong, but there are concerns about its permanence and durability in the face of recent tensions, including the tariffs that were just settled and trade issues. The Korean point of view is not necessarily the same as the perspective held by the media commentators in the U.S. Our panel today is Ambassador Robert G. Joseph. Ambassador Joseph is senior scholar at the National Institute of Public Policy and a former Undersecretary of State and advisor to President George W. Bush on weapons of mass destruction. Bob has his PhD and is also widely respected and been on the Washington Brief several times. And I'm happy to announce our guest panelist today is Dr. John Delury. He's a historian of modern China and on East Asian affairs, focusing on U.S.-China relations and the Korean Peninsula. He's the author of Agents of Subversion, The Fate of John T. Downey and the CIA's Covert War in China, and co-author with Orville Schell of Wealth and Power, China's Long March to the 21st Century. His articles can be found in the Asian Survey, Journal of Asian Studies, Journal of Cold War History, Essays of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy, The New Statesman, New York Times, Washington Post, Book Reviews in Global Asia, and American Historical Review. In 2023, John was selected as the inaugural Sao Fellow in China Studies at the American Academy in Rome. He was invited to remain in Rome as visiting professor of international history and politics at Luis University in the fall of 2024 and visiting professor of political science at John Cabot University in the spring of 2025. He has returned to Seoul, where he was previously based as professor of China Studies at Yonsei University. He's a senior fellow of the Asian Society, public intellectual fellow of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, board member of the Pacific Century Institute, leadership control member of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, non-resident fellow at the Sejong Institute, CSIS, and European Center for North Korean Studies. And he's also a member of the Council of Foreign Relations and National Committee on North Korea. Our moderator is Ambassador Joseph DeTrani, the former director of the National Counterproliferation Center, the former special envoy to the six-party talks with North Korea, and the former associate director of national intelligence. He's currently senior advisor at the Sandia National Laboratories. He's author of The North Korean Threat, Intelligence and Diplomacy, a personal memoir published by the National Institute for Public Policy. We have a great day lined up here, Joe, so take it away. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jenkins, for the very kind introduction. We're very fortunate today to have Dr. Delury with us to do a deep dive, if you will, on North Korea, South Korea relations, inter-Korean relations, but also a deep dive on what's happening between the United States and the Republic of Korea. As we all know, there will be a meeting, a summit between President Lee Jae-myung and President Donald Trump within the next few weeks. We just had a very successful trade negotiations where a decision was made to impose, if you will, 15% tariffs on South Korean products coming into the United States, and a commitment on the part of the Republic of Korea to invest $350 billion per annum in the United States, with $100 billion devoted to energy procurements. So there's so much to talk about, but indeed we'll talk a great deal about the security relationship between the Republic of Korea and the United States. Lots of discussions going on in South Korea and in Washington, D.C., and throughout the United States on our commitment to the Republic of Korea, our concern about what's happening in Taiwan in relations with China, and if you will, the security situation writ large in Northeast Asia. So today we're so fortunate to have, as I mentioned, Dr. Delury, who knows South Korea, who knows the Korean Peninsula, if you will, so well, but the whole of Indochina and the global community. And so today, this is a great opportunity for all of us. And then we'll get into a very interesting, hopefully very interesting discussion with Ambassador Bob Joseph, who is kind enough to join us today. So over to you, Dr. Delury, for an introduction, and then we can get into a discussion. Thank you.
Ambassador and Dr. Jenkins, thank you for the introduction, Larry, for inviting me and putting this together. I'm delighted to be back in the program, and also really looking forward to engaging with the two ambassadors, Ambassador Joseph. So I'm going to try to get through my sort of prepackaged material here relatively swiftly, because I think the meat of this event is going to be the back and forth and the dialogue with the two of you. I have, to get us kicked off, collected my thoughts in terms of, especially, Joe, your question about, what's the view like, or views from Seoul, from South Korea, in terms of the current dynamics with the United States. And I'm going to be very frank in trying to distill that, but we can circle back. And I would say the caveat is it's more complicated than what I'm going to present, but I think this will be a helpful starting point, and important for also Americans to try to understand what all this looks like from outside the United States, and specifically from South Korea. So I would say up at the start, I don't think South Koreans on the right or the left have any delusions about what they are up against. I do think there's a sense that Seoul has to be up against Washington to a degree, against the Trump administration, and also the movement behind it. Let's call it the MAGMA movement for short. At a philosophical level, I think the big problem is that, if I can use the term Trumpianism, and ambassadors, you can come up with better language, but for now, let's say Trumpianism really flips the paradigm of the idea of alliances, viewing alliances as not as these privileged relationships built on trust, which has been the traditional American view, but rather as exploitative relationships based on power. Now, beyond that, Trumpianism also seeks to maximize the interests, the material interests and the security interests of the United States on a zero-sum logic in both the military and security domain and the economic trade domain, doing that simultaneously. So we have to talk about trade and security. And again, kind of flipping the view of the alliance, because as the president reiterates and has for many years, he views, and I think is getting many Americans to see him in his view, that these alliances are to America's detriment, and they're ultimately sort of ripping off the United States. And then the third thing, and I'll come back to this quickly at the end, is that I think we need to introduce another term, and maybe it's because I've spent too long in Rome thinking about empire, but I do think from a South Korean perspective, there's a sort of imperialist aspect that, while right now has not triggered mass protests on the streets of Seoul, I think it's something that we really need to take note of and have on our radar. There's a sort of retro imperialism going back to 19th century type of language about, taking Greenland, Panama Canal, Canada, buying the Gaza Strip. And as the two of you gentlemen with background on South Korea will understand, that can really be playing with fire in certain parts of the world, including in South Korea. Dig into these a little bit, and then we'll move on to the discussion. South Korea, I think, sees itself right now as in the crosshairs. And it's paradoxical because the very reasons that South Korea could feel increasing confidence in the alliance relationship with the United States becomes a liability, becomes a vulnerability in this new era, and particularly in Trump 2.0. As one of the top allies in the Indo-Pacific, which is a increasingly strategic zone of US-China great power competition, as the third largest host of US military forces abroad, with the largest single base outside the mainland United States at Camp Humphreys. And then also, if we bring in the economic aspects, with the 8th largest trade deficit with the United States, just between Canada and Japan, and 6th largest trade partner. To be a little glib, South Koreans can feel like they have a giant orange target painted on their back. All these things you would think would be a list of good are now lists of reason for them to be worried that they will be targeted for a lot of pressure in the years to come. Now, Ambassador DeTrani mentioned the tariff and investment deal. And my sense so far is there was some initial relief. I've not yet detected in the media, for example, a kind of blowback of, we shouldn't be relieved, that was a disaster. But the way I would describe the sentiment is the jury is out, right, on whether this is really a step forward or a step backward for the South Korea relationship with the United States. Again, there was real anxiety because South Korea was coming right up against the August 1st deadline. Japan had gotten a deal. That's always the measure in Korea, is how is Japan doing? Japan got the deal down to 15. Then the European Union got it. And again, I would note, and this kind of comes back to the imperial part. One thing you might not have picked up on the United States was this nervous feeling of so-called Korea passing. This is a classic phrase where Korea feels like they get overlooked. And it was very hard for the Koreans to get their meetings with the Trump administration officials. There also wasn't much explanation of why they couldn't get these meetings. And so that fed a whole anxious discussion here of, is this a strategy, or they're just not paying any attention to us? But as we got closer right down to the wire to August 1st, there was real, I would say, pretty severe mounting anxiety about what this would mean for South Korea if it were left out, as these other countries got their deals. So there was that initial sense of relief, but tinged with, okay, we got through that first hurdle, what's next? Honestly, many Koreans see this as kind of negotiating with a crazy uncle. That you can't be sure what's coming at you next. And one issue, trade issue, I would note in particular, is beef and rice, right? These are extremely sensitive products, not just for economic reasons, but in terms of beef. I remember one of my early experiences in South Korea was coming upon a beef rally that almost overthrew a government, American beef rally. This was back in the day of mad cow disease. So there's sensitivities about public safety. There's a lot of labor issues around rice. And so neither beef nor rice were explicitly mentioned in the deal. The South Korean government assured the public, we didn't give anything up on those. But that's the kind of issue where Koreans are feeling, okay, maybe in that negotiation, but what's coming next? And if Donald Trump suddenly tweets, or with Truth Socials, however you use it as a verb, hey, by the way, the Koreans need to open up the beef and rice market, suddenly there's going to be a feeling of we're back to square one. I think in terms of the investment side, Joe, you mentioned the $350 billion number. I think right now there's actually maybe a bit of optimism. It's such a huge number. It's so vague. I think there's probably a feeling in Korea that that can be leveraged to Korea's benefit. Those can be strategic investments. And I mean, this is Korean capital. These people know what they're doing. So there was no sense here of, oh, we got fleeced. We're going to have to hand over checks of hundreds of billions of dollars to the United States. I think there's a sense of that was prudent. President Trump needs to announce a big win, but that's only going to happen if it's in Korea's interests. Again, jury's out, but that is my initial sense of the investment part of the agreement. So what I'm really looking for at this point, I think public sentiment, as I'm describing it, is not on the precipice. You know, I don't think we're about to see big, call them anti-American or whatever, sorts of rallies. But it certainly weakens the sense of a healthy alliance relationship. And then there's going to be a lot of questions in terms of how does this trade and investment deal actually play out? And Korean companies, corporations are probably the key players to watch in terms of how they implement it. Let me move now to maybe what'll be our more primary topic, though I feel we had to spend a little bit of time on trade, but shifting over to more classic security issues and the state of the military alliance and the question kind of whither US-FK, you know, where are US forces Korea going, and where is the ROK US military security alliance going? And here, unlike with trade and investment, there's not really a reason for any relief yet. There has been no even initial kind of agreement. You know, Donald Trump has made it clear for many years now, because this goes back to his first term, that he wants, in the first term, it was 5 times more in Korea's annual contribution to the cost of maintaining what is about the standard number 28,500 US troops. You know, in the Trump first term, and I was here all those years, it was 5 billion instead of a little under 1 billion. And now it's up to 10 billion. In the first term, the Koreans were essentially able to kind of wait it out and avoid making a deal. And then they quickly made a deal with the Biden administration at the beginning of the term, and then they made another one at the end of the term to preempt precisely the kind of pressure that they're under now. Will that strategy work? And I ask that not, you know, as a genuine question. I want to hear the two of you and your thoughts on it. Can the Koreans kind of wait it out? They probably want to, since it worked the first time, but things work the first time, they don't necessarily work the second time. And also, I think now that Trump has come back, there is more consideration of, okay, this might not be a one-off. You know, after Trump, at this point, you're looking at American politics, you're South Korean analysts, you say, it could be J.D. Vance. We could have 8 years of a Vance presidency. And Vice President Vance would seem as committed to these ideas as President Trump. And so the waiting it out strategy might not be viable. And I think there's more thinking along those lines in South Korea. But where do you go? What is the alternative path? That I don't want to take too much time, Joe, at the outset. So let's circle back and dig into where else things could go. Let me just put in a wild card in terms of where that pressure that's currently exerted on the cost sharing, the burden sharing of the military alliance, you know, where that could go. I do think our discussion has to come into Ambassador DeTrani, especially your bailiwick of North Korea negotiations. Because if we see a resumption of talks between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, if we see the Lee Jae-myung administration, like the Moon administration did, putting itself in that, and we see, a resurrection of this kind of three parties moving forward, then I would expect that to have a back-end effect on the question of how many US troops really need to be on the Korean Peninsula and who pays for them. So I'll kind of plant that flag and we can return to that question. Let me finish with this sensitive term of imperialism that I raised at the beginning, because I do think that while it's not something to worry about in the immediate future, it is a sort of third rail that's been there in the history of US-South Korea relations. And I do think we need to, again, at least have it on our radar. This is also one of those issues that can be a blind spot for Americans, whether they're liberal critics of the current administration or supporters of the current administration. Americans, in my observation, tend to see their country playing a positive role, a leadership role in the world, even at times when much of the world sees the United States as hegemonic or imperialist in its presence. And South Korea is a society we can describe as post-colonial. The 50 years under Japanese colonial occupation has left wounds that are not fully healed. And to understand that, we just have to start talking about the complexities of the relationship at this current moment between Japan and Korea. So usually the outlet for that is Japan. But if the United States continues to move in what right now is just kind of a rhetorical direction, but if we see actual policy implementation of an approach that really does look like a reversion to imperialism, and it takes a direction against South Korea, I think that's where you can see public sentiment jumping in a way that, again, we're not seeing over trade and investment packages. So that language, and again, combined with a policy, can trigger a really serious counter reaction. And if we reach that point, it's probably not only Korea where we're going to see it, but it would take a specific form in Korea and have a deep historical background, a long tail to it. Okay, let me stop there and open it up to our discussion.
Well, no, John, thank you so much. That was just outstanding. What a wrap up of trade and investment issues on the table. But obviously, and you ended with the national security issues related to our great alliance. I can't think of a better alliance, a formidable one steeped in deep history. And the issues that are being confronted, and we will see this with the upcoming summit between Presidents Lee and President Donald Trump. There's no question. But you mentioned the word imperialism, and I'll get back to that and look to Ambassador Joseph to start this conversation. But I'll go back to that element there of ensuring. How do we ensure that we are not viewed as an imperialist country? How do we bring South Korea and the public into understanding that we're there for the Republic of Korea? We're there, but it's not only for the security of the Republic of Korea, it's for the regional security, for the global security, for the security of the United States. So it's a big investment. So over to you, Ambassador Joseph, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Joe. Let me just say good day to everyone who's on the panel, as well as all of our viewers. Dr. Jenkins, thank you. Larry, Joe, it's great to see you all again. John, I thought that was a very thoughtful presentation, very insightful, very informative, and also quite provocative. And I think that is a good thing to stimulate the discussion of that we're going to have today. You've certainly covered a broad range of issues that are vital to understanding the US-South Korean relationship, which I agree with Ambassador DeTrani is absolutely essential for our national security today and in the future. I've taken a number of notes as you presented your thoughts, and let me just cover 3 of those and then add a couple as well. First deals with personal relationships. As we all know, President Trump puts a lot of emphasis on personal relationships with foreign leaders. The immediate focus, as we've talked about, of the Trump administration has been on trade. And just last week, we had a trade deal with South Korea that both sides have described as successful. And you've provided some important background on that, John. My question is, when President Lee and President Trump meet in 2 weeks here in Washington in the summit, now that we have a trade agreement, does that bode well for a strong personal relationship? Certainly, if President Lee comes to that meeting with the type of anti-Trump perspectives that you have described, there could be a real fundamental break in our relationship. I don't think of Trump as being sort of imperialist or neo-imperialist. Trump is transactional. That's what he does. He transacts deals. He makes deals. And whether it's wanting to purchase Greenland or the Gaza Strip, I mean, this is a transactional relationship. This is not an imperialist drive, at least not in any classical sense of the term imperialist. So I'd like to get your sense of, what do you anticipate at the summit? What do you anticipate in terms of their personal relationships? I really hope that the 2 men, when they do sit down together, can find common ground. Because if they can't, I think it does not bode well for the alliance. Because another characteristic of President Trump is that his primary move is to double down, not to change his position. And we'll see. But I'd like to get your perspectives on that, because personal relationships are just vitally important at this time. Second, I think it's also vital to understand that in the US, we tend to view alliances and other relationships from a US perspective, and that's entirely understandable. And most observers in whatever country do the same. But it's also, as you point out, vital that we understand the perspectives of South Korea on the US. National security interests are supposed to be enduring, and I think they mostly are. But fundamental changes can occur with changes in leadership, both in the United States and in this case in South Korea. You saw a fundamental change when Reagan replaced Carter. You saw another fundamental change when Trump, in his first term, replaced Obama. Do you anticipate fundamental changes in Trump 2.0, as you called it, Trump 47? And what are those changes likely to be? I think, again, we will have a much better perspective in 2 weeks than we do now. But it's important to understand that. The third issue, and this is one that you didn't raise, has to deal with human rights. And Ambassador DeTrani and I were involved in a strategy group a couple of years ago that focused on the requirement for a fundamental paradigm shift in our relationship with North Korea. South Korea being an important component of our relationship. And we concluded that it was essential to put human rights at the forefront of our relationship with North Korea. This was based on 5 or 6 strategic propositions. The first being that as long as the Kim dynasty ruled in the North, we would not have a change in North Korean policy regarding nuclear weapons or regarding the human rights in North Korea. Because both of those, the denial of human rights and an increasing nuclear stockpile, are critical to the very survival of the Kim regime. When Trump began his first term in office, he put a real emphasis on human rights. And you'll remember he invited a North Korean escapee to the State of the Union address, the first one. And in 2018, he invited the parents of Otto Warmbier to attend the State of the Union. And then that seemed to diminish. And ultimately, it seemed to go absolutely quiet when he began his summitry, his negotiations with Kim Jong-un. President Lee has a human rights background. President Lee was a human rights attorney, as I understand it. Do you see human rights playing a role in the US-South Korean relationship? And how important is that to South Korea? Fourth, let me just say, with regard to the nuclear negotiations, North Korea is continuing to produce nuclear weapons as fast as it can. And we cited in our strategy report a RAND document that said by 2027, it could have over 200 nuclear weapons. Well, 2027 is a blink of an eye from today. And imagine a North Korea with over 200 nuclear weapons. We can have an American perspective on that, but I would think that the South Korean perspective would be different. That it would be an even greater threat in the eyes of South Korea. We can sit back and say we will deter it. But for South Korea, that's a different equation. It's much different in terms of the nature of the threat. And it's much more than geographical. I think there's something that we need to understand better about how South Korea would perceive that. And does that drive South Korea to a point where it wants its own nuclear weapons? Perhaps even if, or especially if, President Trump starts making comments that undercut sort of the South Korean view that the United States is fully committed to the security of South Korea. And finally, one thing that you didn't discuss, another thing that you did discuss was the nexus between or among China, Russia, and North Korea, and the perspective of South Korea on that. I won't call it a trilateral relationship. I think it's really 2 bilateral relationships. And I think that's very important for us to understand as well, because of the emphasis that the Trump administration is placing on China and building a capability in which alliances play a major role, including or especially the South Korea alliance plays a major role in providing sort of the strategic capabilities, not just military, but across the board, that are necessary to deal with the China threat. So let me stop there and let you respond.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack with that. Good questions, Bob. Over to you, John.
Unpack is an understatement. Thank you so much. It's great. Thank you, Ambassador, for for all those points you raised and your insights. And let me try to at least tackle a couple of the questions specifically that you raised. So first of all, on what to expect from this summit. You'll notice, I'm not sure I said Lee Jae-myung's name in my prepared remarks. And so I do want to clarify that I was not trying to channel his views, in particular in terms of imperialism. That's really honestly probably my own view, but again, part of the history in South Korea. Now he's a product of that history too. But I was not trying to characterize his thinking or any of the language that he's used. Quite the opposite. So to answer your question, I would not expect Lee Jae-myung to march into the White House and try to read Donald Trump the Riot Act about how he sounds imperialistic. Far from it. And I think there will be continuity, first of all, with the way that the last liberal or progressive, if you want to use that term, President Moon Jae-in, who had, we can come back to the human rights issue, but had a very strong background in fighting for democracy in South Korea, and is also a product of that side of South Korean society with sensitivities to things like the US role. He swallowed it all in his relationship with Donald Trump. Moon was very strategic about, look, this guy wants to talk to Kim Jong-un. I want America to finally talk to Kim Jong-un, and I'm ready to nominate him for a Nobel Prize. I anticipate the same kind of attitude, probably even more of it, maybe with more conviction from Lee Jae-myung. Because when you talk about personality, and this is a fairly common analysis, I would say, in South Korea, there's a sense that Lee Jae-myung's kind of a better fit with Donald Trump. I mean, it's hard to predict. It could be that they bounce off each other. They're a little bit too alike, but there's quite a bit of anticipation that Trump will be able to kind of relate more to Lee Jae-myung. The critics of Lee Jae-myung use language to criticize him, not unlike American critics of Donald Trump. That he's sort of bullying, that he's got this strongman attitude. He's considered transactional and pragmatic in terms of, from the left, progressives feel he's not committed enough on a lot of the issues, that he will dump the issue if he sees an opportunity. So you never know how the chemistry is going to play out. But the concerns you raised are not, I think, the ones that we need to be too worried about. It's more just kind of personal chemistry. But Lee Jae-myung will not go in there with a chip on his shoulder. I think he'll go in trying his very best, maybe to be like the Shinzo Abe, who's seen in the Asian context as the one who got on best and established some rapport among Asian leaders with Donald Trump. So we can talk again and kind of see how it goes. But that would be the preview of it. And let me just add, and this will kind of anticipate some of the discussion that we'll have about North Korea diplomacy. Lee Jae-myung comes from that tradition. He clearly positions himself as someone who wants to have dialogue with North Korea, who wants to resume the negotiating process. So he and Donald Trump are pretty much aligned in that Donald Trump continues to defend what he did in the first term. He says it was good to talk to Kim Jong-un. He's left the door wide open to do it again. And so that is kind of the substantive policy issue, particularly security and foreign policy, where I can imagine that section of the agenda, the summit, they're on the same page. And they kind of roll up their sleeves. How are we going to actually do this? This guy won't answer my calls. He won't respond to my letters. How are we going to lure him out? And so that's where I can see the two of them really being able to work together. You raised a question, a fascinating question about fundamental changes, and that's something I think about quite a bit as well. I would say, when I am looking back on Trump 1, and then as this kind of interregnum between obviously lots of continuity even the personnel between Obama and Biden. And I want to throw it back and hear both of you how you see it. In retrospect, to me, it doesn't look like a fundamental change in the course of American foreign policy. But the question is now, will 2.0 be that opportunity for change? What would fundamental change look like? Two examples that are relevant to our discussion already, and issues I laid out in my initial remarks. Donald Trump does clearly have a different philosophy of alliances. I think you would agree. Than Joe Biden, than Barack Obama, than pretty much every American president going back to Harry Truman and FDR. Now, when you go beyond FDR, actually, they look more like Trump. So in that sense, he's as American. But it's a deep rupture with everything we've seen since World War II. And that would be a fundamental change in my book. But he would have to do a lot more to damage or unroll damaging alliances in the second. What he did in 1.0 didn't actually make a dent. Those are deeply rooted, powerful relationships. And I think it would have to be a much more aggressive effort. So we'll see. The second one is a fundamental change, I think, would be the so-called pivot to Asia. This now, I think we're getting to decades-long effort to reorient, to shift the center of gravity of U.S. foreign policy, to put it really crudely from the Middle East to now we call it the Indo-Pacific. And I think it would be a fundamental change if that's the direction that policymakers, direction that presidents have wanted to move in. None have succeeded in really doing it, is my view. And that would be a fundamental change if Donald Trump succeeded in really doing that. And everyone said, oh, clearly it changed, in the course of these years. I'm skeptical. I think it would actually take a war to really change it. But we shall see. So to answer your question, to me, I'm not seeing fundamental change. Those are two areas that I think would constitute fundamental change. But I'd love to hear more, both of you, your thoughts on that. Joe, cut me off. I don't want to go on too long.
No, go ahead, John,
Esther just
please.
gave me all these great. Okay. On human rights. And I think you probably know what I'm going to say here. There is on the left, liberal, progressive side of the Korean political spectrum, you have a paradox where political figures who fought the hardest for democracy in South Korea, for civil rights in South Korea, for, you could say from an outside perspective, human rights in South Korea, are they're not necessarily the least interested, but they're the least vocal when it comes to human rights in North Korea. And that is because there is a strategy that I think we're still seeing in the Lee Jae-myung administration. I think it is, again, we'll see, it's early days, but the way he's positioned himself, the people around him, I think represent continuity with a strategy toward North Korea that does include human rights, but considers the means to human rights improvement in North Korea is not pressure, not sanctions, not going through the United Nations, right? Not speeches and calling them out, but rather, this is classic sunshine policy, right? You get the guy to loosen up, to, in quotation marks, liberalize, to moderate. You get greater economic security, you get greater even basic freedoms for North Koreans, like freedom to travel, freedom to open a business. The way you do that is by dialogue, negotiation, confidence building, engagement, in a word, right? And you don't do that by pointing your finger and calling out their human rights abuses. So that it comes from a general philosophy. And of course, those on the right disagree with that philosophy. And so you see big swings in Seoul from right to left on that approach. And we can debate the pros and cons of that philosophy. But from what I can see, Lee Jae-myung is going to come at it from that perspective, and therefore probably not going to want to go to the UN and give a speech about human rights abuse, but will want to engage with North Korea, including to see improvement in the lives of North Koreans.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
I think if I may, let me
Please.
just jump in here. Very, very outstanding responses to Bob's great questions. Let me go back to negotiations. This is an area that I've spent some time with. Kim Yo-jong recently made it very clear North Korea is not interested in an inter-Korean dialogue with the Republic of Korea. However, did keep it a bit open with the United States and President Donald Trump saying that if the United States would accept North Korea as a nuclear weapons state, then maybe we could have a discussion. But please do not expect a discussion if you're going to be talking about denuclearization. And the White House recently came out and made it very clear that our views on denuclearization have not changed. We're looking at complete verifiable denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And there are no nuclear weapons in South Korea, so we're talking about North Korea on this issue here. And John, you mentioned Korea passing. A lot of concern with our friends, our allies, our partners in South Korea that the United States may do something unilaterally with North Korea and not include South Korea in this dialogue. I don't see that happening. To be honest, I just don't see us having a dialogue with North Korea and not including the Republic of Korea. I mean, this is central to it, and so forth. But what is most distressing is North Korea now almost memorializing that in their constitution, where they're not looking at a peaceful reunification. They're not talking about reunification, where they're talking about South Korea as being the principal enemy of the DPRK, and so forth. And that has to be of concern, especially of concern to many of us, John and Bob. I think many of us are included in this equation, given the new relationship North Korea has with the Russian Federation and the Mutual Defense Treaty and the 12,000 plus troops we see, North Korean troops in Kursk fighting with the Russian Federation in their war of aggression against Ukraine. With the, if you will, the satellite, the nuclear, the missile, and other weapons technologies going from the Russian Federation to the DPRK. This relationship now, in my sense, has to embolden Kim Jong-un, feeling that, look, I have this new ally. It's always been an ally, but Russia made it very clear they were not allies, right? It's not the same relationship that China has with North Korea. China's relationship with North Korea is an allied relationship based on the 1961 Peace and Friendship Treaty, renewed most recently. And the fuel and the energy and so forth, they're tethered to the People's Republic of China, North Korea. Whether they like it or not, they are tethered economically, and I would say geopolitically to the People's Republic of China in that regard. Now they have Russia, and they're participating in joint military exercises. They're talking about hypersonics. As Bob Joseph mentioned very clearly, they're building more nuclear weapons. They're building cruise missiles to deliver those nuclear weapons. But they're also active in illicit activities, cyber, et cetera. And the point that Bob Joseph made on human rights. And this is something I want to clarify also for the record, in our negotiations with North Korea, we made it very clear because North Korea has always talked about their principal goal is a normal relationship with the United States. This is something they want, and they've aspired to, certainly since 1994, with Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung, a normal relationship. And we, as negotiators, made it very clear, you're never going to have a normal relationship with the United States unless you work on human rights, unless you start closing some of those gulags, unless you give some transparency to the monitors who will come in and ensure that you're moving away and you're moving away from that element of terrorism and abuse of your own people and the egregious behavior in regards to human rights. So we've always put that on the table. So I have one major question for you, John. And this is a two-part question, if you will. One is North Korea has left a bit of a door, a slight bit of the door open for U.S., if you will, North Korea dialogue, to resume that dialogue, to if the United States should take denuclearization off the table. And there's concern in South Korea that we, the United States, may cave in and finally say, yes, we'll take that off the table. Many of us, certainly I'm one included, says we should re-engage with North Korea, but not take anything off the table, but keep it down the road. Put enough in there to build the confidence, the building measures that you talked about, John, and other things there, elements of sanctions relief and so forth. If North Korea stops building nuclear weapons, stops producing fissile material for those nuclear weapons, stops launching these ballistic missiles, and stops this illicit activity behavior, and they operate more as a normal nation state. And I think this is something that they've aspired to, but you can't have both. You can't have both in that regard. So the second part to my question is, if indeed they do resume negotiations with the United States and we get into a dialogue, what are some of the confidence building measures we could put on the table? And is there a sense in South Korea that the U.S. may cave on the whole question of denuclearization? And if indeed the U.S. is going in that direction, or possibly going in that direction, isn't that more of an impetus for the Republic of Korea to say we need our own nuclear weapons? And what's the likelihood that South Korea would move in that direction, as we saw in the 1970s when they had their own clandestine nuclear weapons program? Over to you, John.
Again, the commentator and the moderator are getting tour de force commentary soon, which is why I knew this would be fun. And I always learn from you, Joe. And I think that at least keeping up with your, first of all, everything you did on the issue, and then keeping up with your writings, I have the sense you and I have a similar orientation, to I always find myself nodding my head when I read your analysis. And so I don't know that I have an answer for you. I share the concerns you have about what is a kind of pragmatic path forward. What's that look like in the current context where, as you laid out, and Ambassador Joseph, you mentioned elements of this as well in terms of the China, Russia, North Korea triangle, whatever we want to call it. I agree with you, two bilaterals. Kim Jong-un's position is stronger now, maybe much stronger now than the last time there was any dialogue, which was 2018, 2019. And if we go back and revisit that moment, at that time, there was a huge amount of criticism of Donald Trump from the right and the left. I was one of the few people, I'm certainly to his left, I was one of the few people out there saying, no, actually, this makes sense. And his instinct is correct. And the leader-to-leader method is right. If you want to move North Korea, you got to talk to the Kims. And if you want to talk to the Kims, you have to be a head of state. So in that window, I think we saw a version of what you're talking about where they weren't shoving CVID down the North Koreans' throats, but they kept complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula in the statements, right? I believe the Singapore statement was the first time since Kim Jong-un had come into power that he signed off on it, right? Since he took power, he had not said, sure, we'll work toward that. So it was easily dismissed as, oh, they're using that talking point again. Well, no, actually, it's significant diplomatically that you got him to say, yes, this is where we're heading. Now, what his sister has said is you can forget about that, or it depends how we really read her statement, right? And what kind of room is there in that statement? And that's an opening, still an opening kind of gambit. I mean, it was a very harsh statement to the South Koreans. Like, I think in Brooklyn, they would say, forget about it. Like, we are totally done with you. But South Koreans have heard that statement how many times? You know, the South Koreans, I guarantee you the Blue House or whatever we call it now, folks didn't say, oh no, the North Koreans are not going to talk to us. They're like, yeah, okay, that's the opening gambit. Now, how are we going to crack that? So this is where I do hope, I have some hope in the lead up and then in the actual meeting, and especially in the follow through of the meeting for Donald Trump and Lee Jae-myung. I mean, and we may disagree here, gentlemen. I think they got to get beyond their statement. I saw the Rubio statement, you know, of no, we're 100% on complete denuclearization. I mean, fine, that's what the State Department's going to say. But if Donald Trump and Lee Jae-myung do want to resume a dialogue and negotiation process, they're going to have to show flexibility in their language. You know, they're going to have to find a pragmatic path. Now, here, I think the really interesting area is, while continuing on some of the things that were discussed, I mean, you already kind of have a menu from 1819 of things that could be done. The Koreans have theirs with their CMA, the comprehensive military agreement. There are things that they're actionable things they can say, all right, well, let's at least try to get back to that and do this. I think that nuclear question is a lot tougher. I mean, are they ready to close Yongbyon? I'll put that back in a second. Joe, you can say, you know, we're getting close to that in 1819. That feels much further away now than it did back then. To me, a question is, can, in particular, Donald Trump sit down with nuclear stuff for a while? I need you to recommit that, yeah, that's what we're working toward. And then I need you to figure out stuff you can give me in the interim. You got to give me something on the nuclear. I'll give you something on the sanctions on the economic. I'll give you something on the threat perception. Right now we're getting into military exercises. But Donald Trump can also say, and what can you give me on Russia and Ukraine? Because I really don't like this war. Right. And Putin's really pissing me off. And I'm frustrated because I can't, I could use your help. I mean, it's not going to say it that way, right? But now we've opened up a whole new area. I mean, this was not part of your list, from what I understand the history of it, Joe, right? Because now the North Koreans actually have utility when it comes to trying to move the conflict, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, trying to move that toward an armistice, if not a peace agreement. To me, and I'll stop here and then throw it back to both of you, it seems more likely that we could get Kim Jong-un to do something to pull back in terms of North Korea's support for Russia. That to me seems to have more prospect than getting serious progress toward denuclearization. Freezing the arsenal at 100, I think we should be pushing for. But back to one of the points you made, Ambassador Joseph, I don't know, from a South Korean perspective, honestly, I think 100 and 200, I'm not sure that does keep South Koreans up at night. You know, 100 is already enough to take care of South Korea. I think 100 to 200 actually is more at the US level and international level, because it's also about who might they be giving them to. It's not good for South Korean security, but North Korea has already passed a threshold in what they have now. So thank you for triggering the next round of thoughts, and I push it back to the two.
Thank you, John. Bob, I know we're running out of time, but over to you, Bob, for one last question.
I'll be very quick, Joe. A number of points. I was not implying that the president of South Korea is stupid and that he will come into the summit with an anti-Trump barrage. Not at all. The issue is, how much room does he have to maneuver given his own party's positions? And I think that's an open question, because Trump will want something. Again, going back to being transactional, going back to doubling down, I would be very surprised if there's not a discussion about increased burden sharing on the part of South Korea. Second, the sunshine policy. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. They will return to that. That's a question of engagement. It's a question of concessions. It's a question of appeasement. But we know that it doesn't work. We know that from experience, but here we go again. Here we go again, testing Einstein's definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. In terms of engagement, if North Korea is willing to stop building nuclear weapons, stop its missile programs, well, I don't think I need to say anything about that, because they're not going to stop. Okay. So we are really left with, so what do we do? And I think there is a likelihood, I don't know how small it is, but a likelihood that the United States will cave, Joe. That we will say, we can live with a nuclear-armed North Korea. Even if they have 200, even if they have 400, we've got 10 times that much. We can deter them. Now, I haven't seen that discussed as I have with regard to Iran. And there are significant sort of views at high levels in the Pentagon, at least of those individuals coming into the Pentagon, who have expressed the view that we can live with a nuclear-armed Iran. So I certainly wouldn't rule that out. Let me stop there. I see Michael has joined us again, and I know we're really short on time.
So, John, could you respond to some of those points from Ambassador Joseph?
Quickly, I would, I guess, push back in a friendly manner. I'm probably more sympathetic. I'm definitely more sympathetic to the sunshine policy. But, you know, point taken, it hasn't worked. The response, unfortunately, is neither have sanctions, neither has pressure. So we're sort of, both sides of this are stuck with having to look hard in the mirror at the failure of the alternation in both Washington and Seoul of these two approaches. So I will both defend the sunshine policy, but also concede ground that it's failed. And as far as Iran, I mean, that's a big one. But I'm almost tempted to say, Ambassador Joseph, the opposite, in the sense that the fact that the United States, that Donald Trump felt comfortable, safe, bombing Iran in that manner, it raised the question here, wait a second, would he do that in North Korea? And I agree with you, there's a much higher likelihood he and the United States are going to say, okay, we are obviously a nuclear weapon state, so let's end the charade. I don't think, though, the reason is that they feel more comfortable they can deter North Korea. It's that North Korea can essentially deter the United States. North Korea already has such advanced capabilities, as we've been discussing, such a large arsenal, that the Iran option just doesn't exist. North Korea would retaliate, and we're very afraid of how they would retaliate. And the risk calculus is very different than with Iran. Although I was surprised at the bombing.
So I know Dr. Jenkins is there, and we want to close this, but I do have one last question. And John, if you could just keep that response very, very simple, but it's a complicated question. It's the whole question of Taiwan and the U.S. presence in the Republic of Korea, 28,500 troops, our commitment there and everything. But that element of of strategic flexibility, where those troops can be deployed if there is confrontation. Hopefully there will not be confrontation on Taiwan, but if there is, and they could be deployed and so forth. How do you see the Republic of Korea? How do you see South Korea responding to the U.S. request that our troops and our military relationship with the Republic of Korea be also available if there is conflict in the Indo-Pacific region, and indeed specifically in Taiwan?
If not mean to ask me the Taiwan question at this stage, but
I'm sorry, John.
you're absolutely right to bring it up, and let me keep it simple, Joe, which is I think there are two answers to the question. An answer in an actual conflict. I mean, if this invasion happens and it's all hands on deck, the South Koreans are going to be the quote unquote loyal ally, I mean, out of their own interest as well. However, short of that, and in the discussions that have been taking place and are to come, I think South Korea's position is pretty clear. I don't think actually there's much difference between liberals and conservatives. It's that what South Korea wants is for the United States and China to figure out a way to get along, live together. South Korea doesn't want to choose between the two. South Korea certainly doesn't want a conflict. And they are going to, within the framework of being a strong ally, a loyal ally, essentially in a Korean way, gently push back at the Americans to say, yes, we worry about China too, but if we push this too hard, we're going to move it in the opposite direction. And so I think that's where you see this kind of minuet that plays out. And South Korea does it in a different way than Japan, different way than Australia. But I would actually argue South Korea is much more in line with how most of the region really feels about U.S.-China dynamics.
Thank you, John. What a great discussion. I know we went over great questions from Ambassador Joseph. Dr. Delury, you're just doing outstanding work in South Korea. I know your students are getting so much from your wisdom and insights. So thank you for joining us today. Over to you, Dr. Michaels.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Dr. John Delury, excellent insights and presentation, very stimulating. And we're very grateful for the Washington Times for covering this program. And also we look forward to more dialogue with you. Ambassador Joseph, you're the best. We thank you very, very much. And Ambassador DeTrani, always, you make the program go so deep into areas that a lot of the different discussions don't touch, except in private circumstances. So we have a very good following because of the quality of our presenters and guest panelists. Such a great program. I want to thank Chris Dolan at the Washington Times and the threat status team. They're very interested in this program, which Ambassador DeTrani also participates in. And we also want to mention that we are really very, very concerned about the alliance and how it goes forward from here. So we believe that we're in a very important moment in history. It's certainly not the same situation as the past administrations. It's a very new situation developing, and America's role, as always, it will be critical. And we really like to see such experts help contribute to the understanding for the United States and its leadership. So have a great week, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you.
Thank you. John, Bob.
This webcast is pre-recorded.